This is part 2 of Chapter 9, which focuses solely on mental health. Mental health was mentioned in part 1 of Chapter 9 because it is considered to be a key component to being healthy. It is a component that the World Health Organization does mention in its expanded definition. And we did touch briefly on the prevalence of mental health disorders in the American population. But we will build on that knowledge and on that discussion in this second part. So, if you were talking about mental health disorders, 1 out of 4 to 1 out of 5, depending on which data you're using, indicates that a mental health disorder, the number of American adults that are experiencing a mental health disorder in that given year. If you are thinking about a more severe mental illness, something like schizophrenia, for example, this is a little bit more rare. Roughly 4.5% to 6% of the population is classified as having these types of more severe mental health disorders. And what specifically counts as a mental disorder? Your book gives the definition that it is a psychological or behavioral condition that causes distress and reduces a person's ability to participate in everyday life. Mental health disorders refer to a wide range of mental health conditions. Really, any disorder that affects your mood, thinking, and behavior is considered a mental disorder. Now, as sociologists, it might be interesting to raise the question if a mental disorder is just as much a social condition as it is a psychiatric condition. What I mean by this is that all societies have some individuals who behave in ways that are considered unacceptable or incomprehensible, because all societies have behavioral norms, standards of behavior that they expect of people. And when people deviate from those standards of behavior, then oftentimes they can be accused of having a mental condition, of behaving in a disorderly fashion. And this means that, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about diagnoses, that the symptoms, because the symptoms of mental disorder are fairly common, probably much larger than 20 to 25% of the population are experiencing those symptoms on any given day. As I've already noted, 20 to 31% of people in America experience a mental disorder. Over 50% will at some point during their lives. The most common of the mental disorders are depression and anxiety, and they have become much more common in recent decades. As sociologists, you would like to look at the macro level to answer the question why. Think about changes in our society, how we live our lives, how we structure our family and our work lives, where we live and the commutes that we have to endure to get to work, how changes in how disorders are marketed, and particularly how pharmaceuticals are marketed to consumers, perhaps has shifted people's understanding of what it means to be depressed or what does it mean to be anxious. Certainly, the role of stress comes into play here. We know that Americans oftentimes indicate that they are very stressed by a variety of stressors in their lives, and that on the physical level, being in that constant state of fight versus flight and elevated cortisol does begin to take a wear and tear on our bodies as well as our mental health. And your book does discuss the role of ethnicity, gender, and social class, pointing out that although there are some variations, some health disparities, that a lot of these seem to have a lot more to do with access to healthcare, cultural beliefs, and gender roles than a lot of underlying differences. And an example of that is if we were looking at the percentage of adults who experienced a mental illness in 2016 by race. Um, we see that American Indians, Alaska Natives have the largest percentage, followed by non Hispanic whites. African Americans and Hispanic Americans have very similar levels, and then Asian Americans are a little less. But as your book did point out, a lot of these differences in race are fairly negligible, with the exception of maybe American Indians and Alaska Natives. And this is particularly true for those people who are still living on reservations and in reservation systems. And so thinking through maybe, how does that impact their mental health, the social isolation, the financial instability, the kind of population level of despair, how that might be impacting, for instance, depression rates in those communities. As I've already indicated, the symptoms of most mental health disorders are fairly common. If you've ever seen one of those ads for an antidepressant or anti anxiety drug where they go through a list of possible symptoms, how many of us haven't come away from those commercials thinking, hey, that's me. I've been down, I've been blue, I've had changes in my sleeping patterns. I have mornings where I don't feel like I want to get out of bed, and this is part of what has always made the diagnoses and the recognition of mental health disorders a little tricky. Because until recently, when we are now, of course, able to see and to take really good images and scans of the brain and brain activity, before almost all the diagnoses were based on observable behavior and people's self reports. Um, and so this led some researchers and scientists to feel the way Thomas Says does, that an illness is only real only if it affects the body in a way that we can see. And using that definition, you would perhaps come to the conclusion that a lot of mental health disorders would not meet that definition of being real, because although it maybe affects people's moods, it affects the way people feel, it might affect the way that they behave, if it's not actually affecting their physiology in a way that medical practitioners and scientists can observe and measure, then it would not meet that criteria. And so he felt that, if we don't hold ourselves to that criteria, then instead we run the risk of just responding to difference with medical labels, and that those medical labels can stigmatize a person and can do harm, right? So if we're just instead saying, oh, you behave differently than everyone else in society, that must mean that you are a fill in a blank, right, with some label. He had concern, and scientists that share this opinion, researchers that share this opinion, have a concern that we might be overdiagnosing and labeling people that do not, in fact, deserve that label. A controversial study by a psychologist, Rosenhan, which was called On Being Sane in Insane Places, made that point even more vividly by sending out volunteers for his study to present themselves to mental hospitals, just kind of giving a garden variety list of, of, of complaints and traits, presenting as if they were suffering from a mental health disorder, even though they weren't, to see if they would be admitted. And then once they were admitted, they were supposed to stop that behavior to see at what point would practitioners notice that they had locked up someone who wasn't really mentally ill. And it's worth noting that for all of his participants, all of them were in fact admitted to mental health institutions, and it took them a diverse range of time to then get themselves out. With one person staying uh, admitted, I think, for almost 3 months or 2 months. Um, of course, his study has now, there's some ethical issues that have been called into play that kind of make me a little cautious of taking all of his conclusions with complete confidence. But I still like to talk about his study because it just raises that concern of when we are doing diagnoses largely based on self reports and observable behavior, but not physiological changes in the body, are we perhaps over labeling, over diagnosing? And so, and you see that, of course, in how even kind of common everyday interactions and parlance, people will refer to people for being crazy when they act in a way that doesn't fit with behavioral norms. And it raises that question, what is the kind of purpose behind that label? When we label people as crazy or being a nut or whatever kind of term you might would use there, especially when it's everyday people doing it, right? People that do not necessarily have any real practice at diagnosing people. What is kind of our intent behind that? Is it meant to discredit and control people who are simply different? But that observing and labeling is what is at the heart of how we diagnose mental disorders. The kind of official document, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, called it's shortened and called the DSM, has been around since 1950s. The first was published in 1952, and then there has been several versions since then. The most recent is the DSM-5, which came out in 2013. If you look at the kind of changes that have occurred since that first DSM to the most recent DSM, for one thing, there are many more disorders that are now listed in the later versions of the DSM than in the earlier versions. And admittedly, there also are some things that we used to consider to be mental health disorders, things related to sexual orientation and gender identity, that we now no longer do. But this kind of fluidity in the number of diagnosable disorders that exists, that is recognized by the American Psychiatric Association and that is put in their official manual, the fact that these numbers have kind of just steadily increased does kind of go back to the concerns raised by Saez, where he, said when we are basing this not on actual physiological, observable kind of data, but instead just kind of this fluid, you know, how is this person acting? Are they meeting our norms? Are they behaving in a way that we find erratic or odd or socially awkward? It does raise, as sociologists, it should raise questions about kind of, once again, the intent and purpose behind labels. And this just gives you kind of the categories of disorders that are in the DSM-5. Admittedly, this is not my lane, and I'm a big believer in staying in my lane. So I'm not going to go over in this video all of these disorders because I would really just be repeating the information that you see on the chart and the information that was in the pages of your textbook. There will be a couple of questions on it in your test. So you certainly would like to know it, but I'm not going to go over it any further than what you see here. And somehow I am getting random emails. My apologies for that. The next part of this video is just going to kind of talk about how mental illness has been viewed and how the mentally ill have been treated throughout the ages. And we're going to start with Middle Ages, Renaissance, and post-Renaissance, just because this is where we first started to have some kind of differing opinions in how people saw the mentally ill. It's worth noting that before the Middle Ages and Renaissance and post-Renaissance, there was a lot of focus on supernatural explanations, whether it was the work of God or the devil, or in indigenous tribes, communing with the ancestors or having a calling, being kind of a spiritual leader. But a lot of those early explanations were all supernatural. And in the Middle Ages, the supernatural explanations were still very popular. Mental illness was often seen as the work of the devil. People still regularly practiced exorcisms as well as divine healing. Even people that did not necessarily believe that they were supernatural treated the mentally ill pretty poorly. They were persecuted as witches, seen as the fools and village idiots. Countries would literally have what they would call ships of fools, where they would put people that were seen as mentally ill on a ship and just kind of ship them off to sea. But as I indicated, this was also the time period where we started to see some distinctions in how the mentally ill were perceived and treated. And it was during this time period that we had the beginning of institutionalization. And the first mental hospital was actually founded by a Catholic priest in Spain in 1409. And that's because there were some people that were already starting to argue against the inhumane treatment of the mentally ill, and they would advance the ideas that the mentally ill were still human, and they were suffering from a medical illness and not simply sinners, criminals, or possessed. But that viewpoint was in the minority. During the 18th and 19th century, that viewpoint became much more popular and dominant. And this is called the rise of moral treatment. And so moral treatment, which is the idea that you could treat the mentally ill in a moral fashion, help them get better, and if not get better, at least treat them well, acknowledging the humanity that still existed of them. This was kind of the idealistic philosophy that underlied the Great Confinement. And so in 1817, the first American hospital was designed to provide moral treatment. The Great Confinement was the kind of spreading of that asylum model, locking people away. Now, the Great Confinement is a good example of how something did not play out the way it was originally philosophically hoped that it would play out. Dorothea Dix advocated for the humane care rather than containment. So the idea that, and this goes along with moral treatment, the idea that you locked people away not to protect other people, but to help protect them from themselves and help them get better. Unfortunately, many asylums did not practice this humane treatment, and they were, as the picture indicated, no more than warehouses that did little to improve the condition of those locked within. Now, for some of the hospitals that did try to offer this humane care, we start to see the rise of psychotherapy, an approach to mental health in which
patients talked with trained professionals in order to gain insight into the cause of their problems. Um, Over time, moral treatment did decline in significance, and your textbook goes over why. Part of it was the lack of cohesive program. Every hospital kind of did their own thing their own way, which meant what was successful in one hospital was not necessarily put into practice in other institutions. Critics viewed it as a means of increasing patient conformity. So this is where that idea that there was an ideal patient and you're just pushing people to become that ideal patient, not really making them better. A lot of them, especially if they were public and not private, were overcrowded. And not just with the mentally ill, people began to, this became a way of institutionalizing people that, people wanted to get rid of, or that were a burden to their families, financially, or, orphans who had no one else to take care of them. Um, there was still some that held the theory that madness was incurable, in which case moral treatment was seen as a waste of time and resources, particularly money. The influence of psychiatrists with emphasis on the medical treatment. Um, so as psychiatrists kind of grew in prominence, um, their idea that that mentally ill required medical treatment, not just locking someone away and giving them space and time and resources to just become a better person, but that it needed to be treated in a medical facility and with a medical practitioner. It definitely kind of complicated the kind of view on whether the moral treatment, great confinement, was working. And so, with the kind of rise of psychiatrists, we get to the 20th century, which is kind of the era of the rise of therapies. So you have Freud and psychotherapy, but then you also have other medical approaches, electroshock therapy, and lobotomies were popular during this time period. This was also the beginning of the experimentation and rise of psychoactive drugs, which, when we reach the 21st century, we have several shifting things going on here. And I'm actually going to start from the bottom and work my way up because I was just talking about drugs. So by the end of the 21st century, there was a shift back towards remedicalization. And that was after there had been a time period of deinstitutionalization, um, where you moved away from having inpatients to largely having outpatient care. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So deinstitutionalization is when you release people from hospitals into the local communities. And this was encouraged by the Community Mental Health Center Construction Act of 1963. But enough of those weren't built. And then by the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was looking to kind of trim public expenses, a lot of those were closed. So it's worth noting that when some people have very negative views of deinstitutionalization and the success of deinstitutionalization, it's worth noting that's because the idea is that people would not spend their time institutionalized in a hospital, but would be able to remain in their families and community, but to go to outpatient centers and clinics to receive care. But if you close those outpatient clinics and people don't receive care, and people don't have private health insurance to receive care, and we'll talk more about health insurance in the next video, then what winds up happening is people with mental illness, most of them don't receive regular treatment. Which is what your book notes. Only 42% receive regular treatment. And even those with very serious disorders, at 63%, that's not much better. And so deinstitutionalization, that shift from inpatient to outpatient care, was not as successful as it potentially could have been. And a lot of that had to do with the government shifting resources away from there. And around that time, later, there was then the remedicalization, and we see this in two ways. The resurgence of pharmaceuticals, the idea that people can use drugs to treat themselves, the growing recognition of mental health service providers as being a form of healthcare that should be covered, and then also the geneticization of deviant behavior. This is popular with sociobiologists, people that are looking for a biological basis for why some people behave the way they do. And so, the popularity around searching for a sociopath gene, is being a sociopath genetic, all of that reflects a remedicalization. And this is a move away from that deinstitutionalization that we had seen in the 30, 40 years before that. And a lot of the deinstitutionalization was based around the ideas of people like Goffman, who was very cognizant of the fact that being labeled mentally ill um, was a form of stigma, social devaluation, a way of marking people as being undesirable and therefore deviant, and that especially uh, this stigma became even more stigmatized if you were institutionalized. Being institutionalized was especially stigmatizing. That it could become your master status, the one thing that people would know about you, and then that would prevent you from being able to live a full and happy and healthy life, even once you maybe got well. And it was also Goffman that recognized that these mental hospitals, inpatient mental hospitals, that were very popular during that time of great confinement, operated as total institutions, that kind of stripped away all the other influences and identities and statuses and sought to just make people into these ideal patients, this very narrow version of what being well looks like. So it was his ideas and people like him that really kind of influenced that move from inpatient to outpatient care. Outpatient care hasn't been as successful as it could have been because of lack of resources. And now there has been kind of a shift to remedicalization, especially for people who can afford it, afford the pharmaceutical drugs, afford going to a psychiatrist. Um, so all of these things just kind of represent kind of shifting views around how do we treat the mentally ill. And that is that for part two.